Hi, I'm Bryce Bond.
And I'm Linda Pelerin.
This is Dimensions in Parapsychology, and today we have a fascinating program.
Oh, it is a really, really good program.
It's almost
Stay
like...
tuned for this one.
You bet. Stay tuned for this one. There's a new book out called The Philadelphia Experiment and Other UFO... what?
Conspiracies.
Yes, and this man knows a great deal about these conspiracies, and the main thing I want to get into today, plus a lot of other things, is the Philadelphia Experiment. A lot of people have forgotten what that was back in 1943, and we had a young man on by the name of Duncan Cameron, a very delightful soul who began to open the doorway to this fabulous experimentation.
Yes, he did, and today we have Al Bielek. And this man truly, truly has extraordinary knowledge, and he's willing to give it forth to our audience out there to let them have a better understanding of exactly what happened in August of 1943. And if you would just give me a moment, I'd like to ticker tape this down briefly about this book.
Just take a deep breath and relax for just 60 seconds.
Thank you, Bryce. In August of 1943, the U.S. Navy secretly accomplished the teleportation of a warship from Philadelphia to a dock nearby in Norfolk by successfully applying Einstein's unified field theory. The experiment also caused the crew and officers of the ship to become invisible, during which time they were sent to a time-space warp in another dimension. The majority of the crew continued to experience devastating side effects in the rest of their lives, becoming invisible and catching on fire. For the first time, a survivor of the experiment tells his personal story and how the project was actually the end result of Alian Technology, but more specifically, not so much that, but really 12 years of intensive research. The book also covers other classified top-secret CIA, NSA projects, including genetic cloning, age regression, progression, time travel, as well as a host of other topics related to the UFO cover-up. This is our man, Al Bielek.
Whoa, well, why don't we meet him right now? Al Bielek, I want to say thank you very much for coming on the program today. You're a very unusual man, and I want to find out about the Philadelphia Experiment. I know something about it because I was in the Navy at the time where this particular ship, and they were trying to arrange a cloaking device for it that made it disappear.
Correct. Yeah, that is correct in essence. The whole history of it goes back 12 years, but the end result, culmination, was to attempt to make a ship of the Navy completely invisible, not only optically, but to radar. And there's a long series of tests. The final ones on the Eldridge in 1943.
And the Eldridge was what kind of a ship? Minesweeper?
No, it was a destroyer escort. That's why they called it DE. The number was 173. They go by number when they're on the drawing board, and then they give them the name when they christen them. But it was known as the Eldridge for some time, perhaps before the actual commissioning, which happened after the experiments.
Okay, now, you were aboard this craft when this experimentation was taking place, were you not?
Yes.
Or what was your involvement in it?
My involvement was fairly long. It started in 1940. But basically, in terms of the Eldridge, I and my brother Duncan were commissioned to run the equipment in the hold, all of the equipment involving specifically the invisibility experiment. And there was quite a bit of equipment there. We had to know exactly how it ran, what you do with it, what sequence to turn the equipment on, and how to monitor what was happening to it. That was actually our task. Beyond that, we also wrote reports for the Navy because we were stationed both at the Philadelphia Navy Yard and also at the Institute of Advanced Study in Princeton. And all of the basic work was done at the Institute from 1934 on.
Did you have a commission in the Navy at the time?
Yes. Duncan and I both went in the Navy in September of 1939, when we both separately took PhDs in physics. I was at Harvard, and he was at University of Edinburgh, Scotland. Commissions were given to us. It was arranged by our father. And after we spent some 90 days in one of the Navy's 90-day wonder schools, we were assigned to the Institute in Philadelphia, in Princeton, which was at the Institute of Advanced Study. It is not part of the Princeton University itself. It is merely on the same property. It is an independent entity.
So your father was also in and around this particular experimentation as well, was he not?
Yes, very much so, but we have never been able to determine to exactly what extent. He was a Navy man himself. It goes back to before World War I. And there's a picture excellent of him in his Navy uniform, enlisted man's uniform, in 1917. And we assume, but the records are gone, we assume that he finished 20 years and probably got out of the Navy about 1933.
You know, there's going to be a lot of people ask, we assume, there seems to be some vagueness coming through, and I only do this because of the audience out there. We've also got to let the audience know that there's been a lot of experimentation that you have been through that perhaps has affected memory in some regard, has it not?
That's very true. There was a great deal of brainwashing. Debriefing is the common term they use these days. Not only after the Philadelphia experiment and the follow-on work I did was over, but also in a follow-on project called the Phoenix Project. When that was terminated in January of '84, well, finally terminated, then there was a great deal of debriefing, if you will, from that.
Okay. Now I want to get back to the 1943 Philadelphia experiment.
Right. Well, what I can tell you about that is that there was a great deal of work that led up to it. It started in 1931, involved Nikola Tesla, Dr. John Hutchinson, the University of Chicago. He was then dean of the university, and another man, a Dr. Emil Kurtenauer, who was a staff physicist. They were doing a paper study, if you will, a feasibility study in invisibility, and the project was called Project Invisibility at first. They got a little Navy money. They went on. Eventually it was transferred in 1934 to the Institute of Advanced Study. And Tesla, being an old friend of Franklin Delano Roosevelt, he met him in 1917 when he was Under Secretary of the Navy. When Franklin became president, he invited Tesla to Washington, exchange of amenities, and how would you like to work for the government again? He was assigned the directorship of this project, which is already ongoing. So Tesla became the first director. In 1936, they had a first test, which was semi-successful. 1940, they had a fully successful test involving a tender in the Brooklyn Navy Yard. There were two ships, one starboard, one port, that supplied the power and the basic equipment. And this tender was unmanned. It was left quite far apart from the other two ships on long cables. The idea being if something went wrong, they could cut the cables and sink the ship if they had to. But nothing went wrong. The test was fully successful. The ship became invisible. But the important point was there was no personnel on board that test ship. That came later. So at this point, everyone considered it highly successful. The Navy got into the act with unlimited funding, classified the project and called it Project Rainbow, and it expanded. And it was in January of 1940, actually, that Duncan and myself came on board as part of the project. Now, in 1940 on, everything was classified after this successful test. And Tesla was given a battleship by Franklin Delano Roosevelt to make invisible. He had full confidence in the man. And he says, well, you can go from this small ship. If you can make a battleship invisible, you can make anything invisible. So as he progressed towards his test date, which was in March '42, to leave a lot of history out, he became very shaky about the problem that would become, as he felt, a very serious problem with personnel because of very high-powered equipment that was being used to create the invisible field. Now, theoretically, to produce a field of invisibility, we got into some very abstruse physics, but very briefly what they were doing was affecting the time field and rotating the time field, something which was considered, and today is considered essentially impossible, and only now modern quantum physics is considering the possibility that, well, maybe we can manipulate time. We did it back in 1940.
Well, didn't Isaac Newton have something called zero minus or minus zero, where energy and matter meet as a time continuum?
I don't recall a specific statement made by Newton, but he was very much into some of the basic physics, as were other people. And this goes back, in the preparation, if you want to call it preparation, the theoretical work that led up to this experiment actually goes back to the last century. Mm-hmm. There were many people involved. There was not only Tesla, there was a group of people involving mathematics, mathematicians, and those who had done a great deal of research. And all of these people were in Germany, with the exception of one man, Norman Levinson, who was an American mathematician, born 1912, died 1976. And he did the most crucial work, other than Dr. John von Neumann, who took prior work and ran with it, as the saying goes, and developed a whole new series of mathematical systems which led into the work for this project. And Norman Levinson developed the so-called time equations in the time matrix, which was absolutely necessary to understand what they were doing. See, our universe is not, strictly speaking, a three-dimensional universe. It's a five-dimensional universe.
Can you qualify on that?
Yes. Everyone's heard, of course, the dimension called time. Einstein made this very popular. But back in 1931, a man by the name of P.D. Ouspensky, who was a Russian mathematician and a writer, spoke of the fact that we are living in a five-dimensional universe. Fourth dimension being time as we know it, a linear flow, essentially. But the fifth dimension, as later defined by von Neumann, by Einstein, and others, is a spinner or rotating, if you will, a rotating vector on the end of the main time flow. Now, this is a very complex thing which without graphs and paperwork I cannot illustrate. But nonetheless, the fifth dimension was what we were toying with and what we were affecting, because if you change the rate of rotation of that spinner, you change the time field, and you can then take an object and push it in, shall we say, the time manifold or the time complex. And if you push it far enough, it becomes invisible. It does not leave our frame of reference, our dimensions.
So this explains teleportation.
Not quite.
Okay.
This is only insofar as the aspect of invisibility is concerned.
Gotcha.
Teleportation is something else entirely, and what happened was not expected and not called for, and was certainly not part of the experiment. But in the first test in the Eldridge, I might add that the March 42 test by Tesla was a failure because of the fact that Tesla had made it so. He was not going to assume the responsibility for what he felt would be dead personnel due to the very, very high-powered magnetic and electromagnetic fields. Therefore, he sabotaged the test himself to make sure nobody was hurt. Nothing happened, no invisibility. And he said, well, gentlemen, the test is a failure. I'm bowing out. I have other things to do. You're a very good man who can take this over, Dr. John von Neumann, which he did. And von Neumann made his own study, changed the equipment, somewhat changed the approach, and came up with his own system. Now, what happened after that was that in the summer of 42, they decided they needed a special test vehicle. In other words, a ship that was designed from the ground up to run the experiment. And they chose as DE-173 off the drawing board, which is about 1,540 tons laden, a small destroyer. Mm-hmm. They left turret number 2 unfinished so they could drop the large generators down the hole, slide them on rails to the position where they would have come to rest midships, and built the rest of the equipment. The ship was launched approximately September of 42, went into dry dock, and then was at dockside in December of 42 for final outfitting and the beginning of tests in January 43. About March of 43, Dr. von Neumann himself became very shaky about the personnel problem. He, after Duncan and myself both insisted that Tesla was absolutely certain there would be a problem, he finally became convinced himself, and he attempted to correct for the problem by adding a third generator. There were 2 main large generators in the hold. They were driven by 2 right-angle gearboxes with a drive motor in the middle, which is, say, 2 generators vertically mounted like so. The drive motor is up top, 2 right-angle gearboxes, a 750-horse motor driving 2 75 kVA generators. And he added a third generator which was not physically connected with these 2. It was electrically interconnected. The attempt was to create a counterfield to possibly eliminate the effects he felt would be dangerous and destructive to the personnel. It never worked properly. Eventually, the generator, out of control, zapped one of the technicians who wound up in the hospital in a coma for 4 months. He was given a medical discharge after he recovered. That third generator was removed. Von Neumann went ahead, and in June they had sea trials, and in early July they decided we were ready for the tests in July of 43. The first test date for the Eldridge was finally assigned, and it came to pass on the 22nd of July. When Duncan and I were out there in the hold, there were approximately 15 people on board. I might add that a special test crew was obtained by going throughout the Navy and asking for volunteers.
Like you, and you?
Something of that order, but it was truly a real volunteer situation because they were told it would be possibly a dangerous assignment. If they wanted to volunteer for it, it would be accepted if they met the requirements, and they had to go through a special training school, 90 days of it actually, which was at Groton, Connecticut, at the Coast Guard Academy. That training was completed in December of 42, and there is a photo extant of this class with 3 warrant officers, and the head of the class in his Coast Guard uniform was, believe it or not, my father.
Mr. Cameron again.
Mr. Cameron again. So they went on, and everything was set up ready for the test on the 22nd of July. The ship was taken out into the harbor. They did not drop anchor because you do not drop anchor for a test like this. And at the proper command, which is radio link control from the observer ship, we turned on the equipment. And for about 20 minutes, the ship was not only radar invisible, it was optically invisible. Now, I might add that in 1940, there was no real radar. The vast pressures of the war produced very rapid acceleration of the development of radar systems, so that by 1943 we had very good radar, PPI scopes, and many other devices. And they were concerned about radar invisibility as well as optical invisibility. Well, during that 20 minutes, to an observer on the other ship, the ship was essentially invisible optically, lost in a haze, and radar, it just wiped out. There was no radar return. So they gave the command, cease test, go back to dockside, which we did. And then they found out they had a problem.
The ship wasn't there.
No, the ship was there. The problem was that the personnel that was assigned on deck as observers to see what would happen and what they observed were all out of it. They were nauseous, they were sick, they were wandering around in circles, you might say, and they were close to being insane, though not insane. They were totally disoriented neurologically and physiologically, as well as mentally. So the Navy pulled that crew off, and they said, we'll give you a new crew and proceed for the next test. Dr. Van Neumann asked the Navy, begged the Navy, for more time to study the problem and find a solution. At that point, the Navy came up with the drop-dead date. They said, you have a drop-dead date of the 12th of August, 1943. You'll do the test by that date or forget it. None of us understood why. I went to Hal Bowen Sr., who was the manager, the head of the Office of Naval Engineering, as they called it in those days. See, in 1946, there was major reorganization, and they changed it to the Office of Naval Research. Asked him why this drop-dead date. He found out that it came from the Chief of Naval Operations, which was very peculiar, because the Chief of Naval Operations is not concerned with engineering projects. He's concerned with the conduct of the war in all theaters of operation, insofar as the Navy is concerned. But we had the drop-dead date. We had to adhere to it. Came the 12th of August. We were very apprehensive of that morning at 900 hours. Command came, turned on the equipment, proceed, so we went off deck, into the room, closed the bulkhead door, and started setting up the equipment and operating it as per required procedure. To an observer on the outside of the ship, and at that point there were 3 observer ships. There was a carrier, there was another small Navy ship, and there was a merchant marine ship known as the SS Furiaseth. That figures in later examination of what happened, because a very mysterious man by the name of Carlos Miguel Allende was an observer on the merchant ship, and he figures in much of the material in this book on the Allende matters. To those who were observing from the outside, for about 60 seconds, everything seemed to be going perfectly normal and in the desired manner. The Navy changed the requirements. We don't need actual invisibility. We only want radar invisibility. At that time, we did not have satellites. We did not have LORAN, SHORAN, or other navigational systems. Inertial guidance systems were way in the future. We have them today, of course. So they were totally dependent, if there was not radar visibility, on optical visibility for a fleet, and particularly at night. So for 60 seconds, it looked like everything was going properly. And in about 70 seconds, suddenly there was a blue flash of light, and the ship vanished completely. It was gone from the harbor. And, of course, Dr. Van Neumann panicked, and it was gone for about 4 hours. And when it came back, they knew there was something wrong. They could not raise any radio operator on the ship. Through the binoculars, they could tell there was something wrong with the ship. The special radio mast, which carried the antennas for the test equipment, involving 4 2-megawatt RF transmitters as part of this experiment, was broken. Part of it was missing, and they could see there was some kind of a turmoil going on. They sent a special launch out with special people on it to get aboard ship and find out what was going on. What they found dismayed them terribly. They found 2 sailors buried in the steel decks, 2 buried in steel bulkheads.
In other words, fused within the steel deck.
Fused is correct. Fused is the correct term. The metal was actually intermingled molecularly with the flesh and bone of the bodies.
Now, where were you guys?
Well, I was in the hold. I came out on deck. Duncan was not there anymore. See, there's a sequence we have to go into what actually happened later.
Let's just hold on to that briefly because I know that Linda wants to come in and continue the interview with where we are right now.
My name is Linda Pelerin, and this is Dimensions in Parapsychology, and our guest today is Al Bielek. So far, Al, this is a fascinating interview, and I like the way you're giving names, dates, and times, because it puts a scenario together for our audience out there so they can better understand just what really did happen. Also, there's a wonderful, most marvelous book here called The Philadelphia Experiment and Other UFO Conspiracies that I would highly suggest for this audience to purchase, pick up, and start reading. Educate yourselves. And also, Al will be giving various lectures in town. Of course, we can't give dates, but very shortly after the show airs, if you would get in touch with Bryce at 861-7189, that would be 212-861-789, you could get more information about this. His lectures are fascinating. Now, let's just get back on what you were talking about. To encapsulate it quickly, you did talk about how the inception of the experiment, how it was, how Tesla dropped it and turned it over to...
That's correct, to Dr. John Van Neumann.
Van Neumann, and how there was a deadline set, even though there were some problems with the experiment, and a fear that it might molecularly harm some way a human being.
Well, at the time of the initial tests, there was no such consideration that there would be that kind of a problem. At the time when they had the first test and there was some mentally disturbed personnel who had been on deck, I might add that those who were behind steel below decks, or as Duncan and myself were in the control room for the equipment, we were not affected. The reason being that with all that steel, the magnetic fields are absorbed as well as the RF fields.
I see.
Now, it was only those who were stationed on deck, deliberately stationed on deck, to be observers as to what they saw. By arrangement with the Navy, as this was part of the experiment. They were the ones who were hurt.
They were the ones in greatest danger at that moment.
That's correct.
Now, let's just continue on with what happened.
All right. Now, the second test, as I said, was concluded. They could not raise the ship when it returned after a 4-hour absence. They could raise nobody on board, so they sent a launch out. The people came on board. They found 2 men buried in the steel decks, dying, 2 men buried in a steel bulkhead, vertical upright, like they had walked into the wall and then suddenly been locked into the steel. And the 5th man with his hand in the steel also. All 4 of those men died. The 5th man with a hand in the steel lived because the medics just cut his hand off and gave an artificial hand later. He survived. I was there. Duncan was not. It's a long story as to why he was no longer there. But they ordered a special crew on board to bring the ship back to dockside. And there was later a burial detail for those who were dead. There were other serious problems. They had some people who were missing. They had people who were on fire, a very strange type of fire, because the bodies were, to appearances, burning, but like the biblical story of the burning bush that was burning and not consumed, the bodies were not consumed. There was an etheric fire, and the Navy spent a great deal of time and money in trying to, quote, put these fires out, unquote, if you will, and get these personnel back to some semblance of normalcy.
They were fires from within?
It's very hard to explain what type of fire it was. It was not electrical. It was etheric, which says perhaps it was from within, but it was a phenomenon which nobody had ever seen before.
Did the flesh burn?
No, the flesh did not burn. The bodies did not burn. But it was a visible fire. They wound up in the funny farms and stayed there the rest of their life. Some of these people went to the hospital and eventually recovered. I gave my report because when they brought the ship back to dockside, there was 4 days of meetings deciding or trying to decide what to do next. I gave my report. Duncan was not there to give his report. He did not return. And, of course, I'll have to say what really happened to the ship. The story was that they couldn't figure out what was wrong. I told them what happened. Nobody believed me. Dr. Van Neumann didn't believe me. And they decided on one more test, which was held in October, unmanned, in the outer harbor by, again, long cables, like the original test. They took the ship out in the outer harbor, pulled the crew off when they were on station, and then conducted the test by means of 1,000-foot long cables to turn the equipment on. They had a lot of spare equipment because they expected everything to be successful. Therefore, they'd already built several sets of equipment to be installed immediately on other ships if it was a fully successful test. So they turned the equipment on at night, late in October. The ship disappeared for about 15 minutes, came back by itself, and the control room was a smoking ruin. So the Navy gave up, washed their hands of the project, ordered the Eldridge returned to dockside and stripped of all of this equipment, set up for normal sea duty, which it was, and from that point on, after it was re-outfitted, it went with a normal crew out to sea, solo war duty. 1946 it was placed in mothballs, and in 1951 it was turned over to the Greek Navy, along with another destroyer. The Greek Navy accepted it. It was renamed Alian. And they had a little problems at first. They finally resolved them. And
What kind of problems did they have? What do you mean?
the rumors were that they had ghost images wandering around the decks. So they stripped the ship, repainted it and everything, and apparently it was all right after that.
Did all of the men return? In
No.
other words, some
No.
were having this etheric fire reaction, some were fused into the bulkhead, some went insane, all these various things. Your brother was never seen again, well,
Not in
at
that
time.
At that time.
At that time. Now, were any of these men just lost? Aside from your brother, no one knew what happened to them, so they were actual sailors that were missing.
There were two people who jumped overboard other than Duncan and myself, and I'll get into that shortly.
All right.
Those two apparently disintegrated and disappeared completely. There were others who literally walked through bulkheads and vanished and were never seen again. This was on the deck. Down below, they knew there was something wrong, but they didn't know what was wrong. And there was one officer down there, a lieutenant commander, and he is alive today, and he's verified a lot of this to me from his own memories and his own experience. But they didn't know what was wrong, but they knew something was wrong. And of course, when the ship was finally brought back to dockside and they were all gotten off and were removed from the ship, then they saw what had happened and they knew something was drastically wrong.
Now, Al, when you made your report, why wouldn't someone believe you? It doesn't make sense to me because there was actual proof with these men fused into the bulkhead and all of that.
That's true.
I'm not challenging you right now, Al. I believe what you're telling me. What I'm trying to say is I don't understand why they gave you a hard time at that
I'll tell you why. Because from our side of the coin, that is where we were in the control room, I'll tell you exactly what happened. For the final test, when we turned the equipment on, everything seemed to be functioning in a normal manner for the first 30 seconds.
Mm-hmm.
Then we started getting strange fireworks in the control room.
Mm-hmm.
The banks of tubes, there were some 3,000 6L6 tubes in there to control and run the fields on the two generators. There were 5 field windings each generator. They started to waver and do strange things, and we started to get electrical arcs all over the inside of the control room. When it kept getting worse, and we had no further information from shore, we didn't know what had happened when we were inside that control room. We realized something was drastically wrong. We had no directives as to what to do, so we were on our own responsibility. We decided we had to turn the equipment off. So we went for the main control panel and the main power switches mounted on the wall.
Yes.
Went to turn them off, and they were frozen. We couldn't budge them. And
Now, just a minute. Let's stop right there. Very interesting. So what had happened, was there an energy and a power that was whipped up, so to speak, on a manual basis through our man, and then once it was set free, man had no control over this
we had
anymore?
no control over what was happening. We had no idea what was happening. But we decided at that point we better get out of there. And we opened the bulkhead door, walked out on deck, saw people running around in circles. At this point, no one was buried in the steel decks.
I see.
But they were running around in circles. There was this heavy, hazy fog.
What color was it?
It was on the greenish side.
Like the Bermuda Triangle fog?
Yes.
Ah, go ahead.
And we both had the idea at the same instant of time, let's jump overboard. We'll get in the bay and we'll swim ashore.
Right.
So we jumped overboard. We never hit the water. We fell through what later we realized was some very strange phenomena, perhaps like a tunnel. And after about a minute, approximately, we don't really know how long it was, but it seemed like about a minute, we wound up standing on dry land at night inside the perimeter of a military compound with a chain link fence in our backs. And suddenly there was a helicopter overhead with a very bright searchlight shining it down on us. Now, of course, what did we know about helicopters? In 1943, Sikorsky was still working to make it a viable product for the military. But this, as we found out, was no longer 1943. We were grabbed by MPs. We were taken into a building on an elevator downstairs. The doors open. We were met by an elderly civilian. He says to us, "Gentlemen, we've been waiting for you. My name is Dr. John Van Neumann." We looked at him and says, "You who?" He says, "I'm Dr. John Van Neumann." He says, "You can't be. We just left him an hour ago. He's a much younger man." So he said, "No, gentlemen." He says, "I am Dr. Van Neumann." He says, "You're no longer in 1943. You're in 1983. And you're at Montauk, Long Island. And we have been running an experiment here. And you are now in a totally different time." They gave us a Cook's tour. They proved to us we were no longer in our own time for the simple reason in 1943 you didn't have color television. You didn't have graphic displays. You did not have any computers whatever. Those were developed by Van Neumann later in 1949 to 51, 52. And they had graphic displays, computers, and all types of electronic equipment, which we did not recognize, but we did recognize the fact that it was something far beyond our time. So eventually they convinced us. Watch TV for a while. You'll realize that you're no longer in 1943. I mean, when you see jet planes, modern automobiles, city skylines on TV, you realize something's wrong. They convinced us. We were there, and then he further told us we had to go back to the Eldridge and smash the equipment because it had locked up with the experiment in 1983, the Phoenix Project, and it had created a huge bubble in hyperspace, and the bubble was growing. It was being fed by the energy from both the Phoenix Project and the Eldridge. He says, "We have no control over the Eldridge." He says, "We will send you back there." And I said, "You will send us back?" And they said, "Yes, we have equipment, we can do it. And you must destroy the equipment however you do it." And this meant, of course, using physical means such as axes, which we did do. They sent us back after about half a day on the station. We were there. We arrived, as we found out later, about 2 a.m. in the morning. They were waiting for us, and we were going to arrive. Van Neumann had all the reports from the past.
Yes.
And we stayed there during the day, a greater part of the day. We never got off the base, but we did go outside. And we were sent back. We destroyed the equipment. And as the field started to wind down, we went out on deck. We arrived on deck. We went in the control room, grabbed axes, smashed the equipment that we had to smash. And as the generator started to wind down, we went back out on deck. And it was then that we saw personnel in the steel, 2 in the deck and 2 in the bulkhead. Turned out one of those 2 in the bulkhead was our younger brother, Jim, who had enlisted in the Navy 6 years later. He was 6 years younger than us, and he enlisted not 6 years later, but after 1940, after the war was on. He was one of the volunteers picked up in the Navy to be part of this project. We were not too happy about it, but there he was, and he was one of those caught in the steel. Duncan, for whatever reason, we've never figured out exactly why, jumped overboard before the fields collapsed and wound up back in 1983. And he died there. Now, what part of 1983, I don't know, but it was in 1983. He died there, and he was reborn later by extraterrestrial manipulation and very exotic hardware they had in the Phoenix Project.
Now, on that, I want to get into that a little more if you can.
Okay.
But we're going to have to take a brief break. Excuse me, and unfortunately, we'll be right back. I'm Linda Pelerin, and this is Dimensions in Parapsychology, and our guest today is Al Bielek. I say no more. Al, you were talking about the Philadelphia experiment. You were talking about some of the horrible things that had happened because of this experiment. Then you were talking about time travel, and now we're getting into some material on extraterrestrials. Now, before we get into this, can you sort of just briefly encapsulate, if someone's just tuning in right now, some of the things that you've told me so far to get up to the point where Duncan died in 1983.
Yes.
You were sent back, and then he lived again, in other words.
Right. Now, he returned in 1983. This was not part of the program, so to speak, or expectation, but he went back due to an accident. He died in 1983, and he was born into another body. The information was sent back. So you have to understand that in the Phoenix Project, both due to the extraterrestrial involvement and the even more advanced science, as a result of the successful completion of the Philadelphia experiment in 1953 with a totally different test, and I'll get into that, the work continued And eventually came the Phoenix Project, in which they had total control of time and space. They could send an object or a person anywhere in our galaxy.
This was being done in Montauk Point?
Yes, anywhere in our galaxy or in any time to approximately 100,000 years in the past, and we assume to about 1 million years in the future. But they were able to do this. Consequently, there was no problem to send us back 40 years. So I was returned. Duncan went back to 83, and they had communications with other people as required back into the year around 43. Now what happened was, when they knew, that is my father, who had apparently a great deal of connections and a great deal of savvy about this entire experiment and all that was going on, he was told that Duncan was dying, and it was in 83, and he had to get busy and make another son. So he found himself another wife in 1951, his fifth wife, I might add. In 1951, the new Duncan was born, same name. His father named the new one in memoriam, so to speak, of the original Duncan. And in 1963, the real Duncan, the soul, was a walk-in on 12 August 1963 and took over this body by arrangement. This was all arranged.
A walk-in like Ruth Montgomery's walk-ins?
Like any would walk in, as a soul walks into a body, but this was by consent and by arrangement, so that he would have another body. It was essential that he maintained a continuity, that he remain alive, and it was also essential that I remain alive.
Why?
This gets into the...
Wouldn't it be better to have you gone?
One would normally think so.
One would.
And normally, if the Navy wanted to silence somebody, or any other agency wanted to silence somebody, the quickest and easiest way is to shoot them or otherwise bury them.
Exactly.
But they couldn't do that with us for another reason. We were part of the experiment, and we're part of the stabilizing factors for what are called Levinson equations and the Levinson time matrix. This
What
gets
is that?
very involved mathematics, but what it says is that the actual coupling of those two experiments,
Yes.
from 12 August 43 to 12 August 83, caused a rift in time, a hole in hyperspace which was 40 years wide. And like in electromagnetic theory, and anyone who's an engineer knows what I'm talking about, if you have a terminated impedance in an RF transmission line, if it's properly damped, that is, a terminated in its characteristic impedance, you have no standing waves. It is a smooth transmission of energy. If it is not properly terminated, you get standing waves.
You're talking about a giant short.
Now, or open.
Uh-huh, okay.
In this case, the transmission line was timed.
Ah, okay.
And without proper damping on the later end, actually both ends, but the later end was a concern, in other words, 1983, without proper damping, there would be ripples in time, very much like a standing wave in electromagnetic theory, which would take place in an RF line and would produce enormous ripples.
Not like a microwave.
No, not like a microwave. It would produce enormous ripples in time, and the consequence of that could be to roll our reality over into another alternate reality. This had to be damped, and for reasons still unknown, Duncan and I were the damping factors, and we are holding it stable for another 20 years.
So you and Duncan are walking plugs.
You might say that.
I'm trying to. I know between the microwaves, the shorts, and the walking plugs, I'm trying to simplify it here for myself and for the people out there. You know, it's funny because when you began to talk about this story, I started to think there's something to do with you, your structure, your involvement between the two energies. That's like the glue, the fuse that's necessary to keep going.
Right.
Now, we're not even going to try to figure out why or how.
No, it's not really possible to figure out precisely why, but we were the two who traveled through that time circuit, and consequently we're directly involved with the transit through that 40 years, and it must be stabilized, and it cannot be done with electronic hardware. There's no way, at least at this time and era, where it can be stabilized electronically. It's not saying it's impossible, but it's not known how.
Now, because of your existence, because of what you're telling us now, is that stabilized, or is that hole, that gap, that energy that's gone awry, increasing and growing?
No, it's all stable, as long as we're around. As long as we're around.
Well, I got to keep you healthy.
Right, you're not the only one that's concerned.
This is very true. You've got to eat your Wheaties. Now let's get back on the serious subject here. So we were talking about the stabilization process, why Duncan needed to be regrouped, so to speak, and we needed to have reborn another Duncan. It's almost as if they cloned for him a body, in a sense.
No, it wasn't cloned. It was actually a true body born in the normal manner. In the normal manner from the same father, but again, another mother.
What's this extraterrestrial?
This had nothing to do with the extraterrestrials insofar as the birth process was concerned.
Okay, but what did it have to do with the extraterrestrial?
Okay, the extraterrestrial connection is primarily on the Phoenix Project end, because the technology, as it developed, let us say from the point after 1947, when the project was reopened by Navy request, and von Neumann looked at it again and decided he could salvage something, and decided he found the answer to what the personnel problem was, and I don't know what the answer is myself as to how it was solved, because after 47 they eliminated me. But he went ahead, he realized that he must have a computer. There was no electronic computer to that point. So he developed the first all-electronic computer using tubes, since, of course, they've gone to solid state. But in 1951, he had it working at the Institute. In 52, he built a new system. It was delivered to the Navy. In 53, they had a fully successful test on board another Navy ship. No personnel effects, no side problems. Fully successful. So what did they do? They changed the project name again. They called it, from that point on, Project Phoenix. And then they went on to other things, further development, and through several generations of development, and eventually this became the beginning of what was called Part 1 or Phase 1 of the Phoenix Project. Now, the Phoenix Project was already ongoing from 1947 at Brookhaven National Laboratories, and it remained essentially there from 47-48 until 68, when it was terminated by orders of Congress because they started reading the monthly reports about what they're doing, and they were into mind control. And these were repatriate Jewish scientists who had been brought over from Germany during World War II, or prior to World War II, actually. And Congress decided they don't want mind control. It might be used on them. They terminated the project, kicked all of the scientists out of Brookhaven, and they were picked up by the Army at the famous point at Montauk. The Army already had a large military operation going there. It had been there since World War I, and actually a little prior. And it was operational. So they went out there to continue their work. Along about 1962 or 3, the Air Force takes part of the property and develops and builds the SAGE radar early warning system. That was only one of 25 stations at Montauk. They were all around the periphery of the U.S. In the late 60s, they were all declassified, they were all terminated, and they were shut down because they had a newer system, namely BMUs and the DuLine projects up in Canada. Mm-hmm. So they abandoned these. And they were abandoned, literally, held by Surplus Property Administration in Washington. These scientists saw a brilliant little possibility and a beautiful idea. They could move into this abandoned property held surplus, not declared as known and operational by anyone. The Army had already moved out. And in this area, they built what became the later phases of the Phoenix Project, namely the time travel, which was Phase 3. And that started about 1963 with a paper study elsewhere. Then about 73, they started moving hardware in. 75 was the first tests. They did not have that system fully operational, 77 or 78, with many, many engineering changes. But they solved the problem with alien help, because there were aliens there transcribing their data from their computers to our computers, which at that time an IBM 360 or a 370 was the most advanced computer we had. Mm-hmm. Now, of course, we have much better ones now, but they were stuck, so to speak, with what they had already contracted for. Never really worked all that well, but they made it work. Later on, the Cray 1 was developed, and that became part of the project. But they developed fully operational the capability of traveling in time and space. And the combined effect of the two, paraphrasing Dr. Carl Sagan, who talked about wormholes in space and time, they were doing it.
Now, I've got to leave this segment of the show pretty soon, and Bryce is going to come back on, but it occurs to me that you're talking about such advanced technology at that time, as opposed to technology that was not advanced at all. And how did the twain meet? And in other words, where did we get these ideas for such advanced technology to be able to do the time travel, yet our computers were so baser? Do you know where I'm coming from right now, Al?
I think I understand what you mean. Well, don't make the mistake of saying that the technology involved with the so-called Philadelphia experiment was not advanced. It was very advanced for its day, but it kept being upgraded.
I see.
Went through several generations. And of course, in 1954 came the famous agreement that President Eisenhower signed with the Greys, the ETs.
This is what I wanted to get into.
And this is the thing which led the way.
All right.
It was not the first agreement that had ever been signed, but in 54, due to an overwhelming thrust of the alien technology, the government was put into a panic mode where they realized they had no choice but to make some kind of an agreement and buy time.
And we're going to have to stop right here and keep going on that one. Bryce will be right back.
Thank you, Linda. Continuing now with our guest, Al Bielek, and he was part of the Philadelphia experiment back in 1943 and told us some very revealing bits and pieces of information which seem to be a little bit mind-boggling, that we have right now upon planet Earth a little liaison with extraterrestrials. And God knows there's been a lot of UFO sightings and things like that, but they sort of been whitewashed. But this particular project, you know, and then you speak about Duncan, your brother, who has been reborn again in a new body. You've also spoken about yourself, that something has happened to you.
Yes.
You speak about this time window, or 40-year time window. There's also things happened at Montauk Point, Long Island, by the way. Montauk Point, there was an old abandoned radar base. And this basically is what was being used, but you know, I don't know if it's true or not, but I just want to report this to you to see if there's any validity to it, that I think a couple of years ago, that there was an energy that when this base was still in operation, that there was a great, huge form that came out of this time window, so to speak, and there was about 7 people killed, and a couple of houses were crushed down and splittered, and then a couple of days later, there was a lot of concrete trucks rolling in to pour concrete down these silos.
True.
What?
That's true. In the final day of the Phoenix Project, which was actually the night of 12 August 1943, something happened in that a monster, if you like to call it in terms of a movie entitled Planet X, or the Forbidden Planet as they called it in the movie, Monsters of the Id and this sort of thing. This little monstrosity, which looked perhaps like a Sasquatch, but a little bit bigger. The descriptions varied between 12 and 30 feet, depending upon how terrified the individual was who saw it, going around smashing buildings, picking people up and throwing them against concrete walls and other buildings. This monstrosity apparently was totally out of control. It was completely physical and manifested as a solid three-dimensional being, if you will, and was apparently a function and a creation of the transmitter and the computer complex itself. If you remember, quite some years ago, Einstein made a comment. He says, if you endow a machine with enough complexity and enough power, eventually, of itself, it will become intelligent. And apparently this is what happened to the complex out there, because in that night, before the whole thing was down, Jack Pruitt, who was then the station master, realized that it was so totally out of control. The orders went to pull the main power switches on the entire complex. They did, and nothing happened. No power was shut off, except for perhaps a few lights. Then they went out with axes and cut the cables. Loco was supplying power to the station at that time, 440 up to 2 megawatts, 3-phase. And they cut the cables. Station kept right on running. They realized then they had a real problem, and speaking in terms of theory, this station, this computer complex, had learned with all of the technical information stowed within its computers and its memories how to tap the Dirac Sea. It was supplying its own power. So the only way to stop it was to do what Jack Pruitt did. He told everybody to get out as fast as you could, run for your lives, and he went with an acetylene torch into the inner radar tower in the innermost section and started cutting cables between sections of the computer. And when he cut enough cables, the computer was down, the brain was cut in pieces, if you will, and the station went down. And as the station went down, Junior, as we sometimes called him, the monster, dissipated, so that a few hours later it went back to where it came from.
Now, how long did this so-called monster live or manifest itself in time?
Approximately from the afternoon until late that night. Let us say about 8 hours, 6 to 8 hours.
Now, there also is speculation going on that the monster basically was a thought form which materialized physically or was enhanced and expanded.
Yes, it could have been a thought form. It could have come out of somebody's head operating the equipment. But in any case, even if it was a thought form to begin with, it became clothed in solid materiality by the station, by the equipment, by the computer, and its capabilities.
And it was able to do physical things.
Very physical, just like it was a real, honest-to-God creature.
In other words, this Montauk radar base, the abandoned radar base, was a very sophisticated technological complex, was it not?
After it was completed and operational, yes, it was very sophisticated.
And some people indicate that there's a connection tunnel between RCA, New Jersey, to the tip of Montauk Point. Would you say is any truth to that, or is that pure speculation?
I don't know. RCA, New Jersey, no, I don't know. ITT, Newark, New Jersey, yes.
Okay. Now, I just want to get back, basically, to the Philadelphia experiment. When you jumped overboard, you came back in 83. Did you say 1983? Or
we both arrived in 1983.
Right. Were you both the same age at that time?
Yes. There was no change in our appearance physically.
So basically, the movie, there was a film out called The Philadelphia Experiencer. It was pretty accurate in many ways.
The first 12 or 15 minutes were very accurate in the sense that they portrayed almost exactly what happened, even to the last night in the bar, which, by the way, happened to have been the Blue Lagoon in downtown Philadelphia. It's not there anymore. And the whole process, the whole procedure, except for one aspect, they gave the wrong date. They gave October 43. And the second aspect was they didn't have that many people on board the ship. They weren't literally on a skeleton crew because they didn't need that many people.
Yeah.
They wanted a few observers, and they had to have a minimum number of people to run the equipment and run the various systems of the ship, including navigation, and a temporary captain. It was Captain Engel. He was not the regular captain.
As far as you know, Al, how many people are left from that particular ill-fated...
alive today?
Yeah.
In their original bodies?
Yeah, in the original bodies.
Perhaps 6.
Perhaps 6. But their minds are gone?
One case might be. 3 of those people refuse to communicate. They will not talk with me. They will not talk with anyone. I've made attempts to contact them, but they will not either admit they were part of it or they just will not talk at all.
Let me ask you this. Why are you talking now?
Because I feel it is absolutely necessary that the facts of this story get out to show this as only one, or of course with the Phoenix Project, 2 examples of government cover-up, government duplicity, government lying. In the case of the Philadelphia experiment with taxpayers' money. In the case of the Phoenix Project, no taxpayers' money was involved.
Do you feel that by you communicating like this, it's jeopardizing your personal,
No.
yourself at all?
Theoretically, it could be, but it has not, and I do not believe it will for reasons I know. One of the other reasons involved in this, of course, is the old so-called martyrdom clause. It's called, you've probably heard of years ago, Mark Jessup. He was a PhD in astronomy, internationally known. In 1955, with the arrival on Admiral Firth's desk at the Office of Naval Research in Washington, a paperback book entitled The Case for the UFO, which was written by Mark Jessup, but it had many, many footnotes handwritten in the margins, and they claimed to have been done by Carlos Miguel Allende. Jessup was called to Washington. A commission was set up, headed by George Hoover, then in the Navy. And the purpose was to investigate all of this. They called Jessup in. What do you know about this? He said, well, I wrote the book. Well, we mean the notes. Don't know anything about it. They called him in 3 times. And he eventually got a copy of these notes and became very interested in them because they mentioned, among other things, the Philadelphia experiment. And most of the people in the Navy at that point had not heard of it because all of the old people, the old guard, if you will, had been retired forcibly, if you will, in about 1947. All of the people from World War II were kicked out, told to retire, whether they wanted to or not. And a whole new group, officers on down, were in the Navy. And most of these people knew nothing of the Philadelphia experiment. So this surfaces. Jessup becomes very interested. And he starts to do his own research. By 1955, he had a massive file on the subject. Called up a friend of his one day. He was then living in Florida in Dade County. The man he called up was a Dr. Valentine. Excuse me. He says, I think I have the answer to this whole thing, the Philadelphia experiment. I'll grab my notes. I'll be over to see you in about an hour. This was in the middle of an afternoon. He never arrived. Next morning, they found Jessup's dead body in his car in a park in Dade County with the proverbial hose of the exhaust plugged around into the window. He was dead of monoxide poisoning. And, of course, his briefcase and notes were missing. This blew up into the press. There was a lot of press coverage for months on this, particularly in Florida. He didn't. He was on a secret project, and he was doing research and so on. The net and bottom line was that an enormous amount of publicity was given to this thing and what he was investigating, which was the last thing the people who had him, ordered him dead, wanted. So ever since, it's been called the martyrdom clause. They've never pulled this one since. If a person is in the public view, in the public eye, and is talking about, let's say, secret projects or some
Safe as
other...
they become, in other words.
They are essentially safe because the price of martyrdom has been paid, and they do not want to pull this again. Because if you do, if a person suddenly dies or is mysteriously killed by an accident in the middle of telling about these various things, the public is very likely to say, well, he's dead. There must have been something to what he said. Why did they kill him?
Exactly. On that note, I want to say, Al Bielek, thank you very much for being on the program. You've been extraordinarily enlightening. And this is very thrilling to talk about. And I just want to make mention that there's more information in this book called The Philadelphia Experiment and Other UFO Conspiracies. It's by Brad Stagger with Al Bielek, and it's filled with information.
Again. We have Allentown again, and he's here just for a brief amount of time, but we were able to spend some time together to get into some more information about extraterrestrial encounters and also the development of technology through alien means. Now, am I all washed up saying this, or is there something to what I'm saying?
It's a great deal to what you're saying.
Well, tell me more.
Well, as I had said in the previous segment, there was an agreement made in 1954 between a certain group of aliens commonly called the Greys and President Eisenhower, because the threat of a massive invasion was there and a massive improvement in technology so far beyond what we understood. The government panicked, felt they had to make an agreement to try and buy time. Two things were done. One, there was a mutual agreement of non-interference with each other. We would not interfere with the alien technology if they did not interfere with our technology or our lifestyle or our society. And they were given first a special base out in the West, and then eventually a whole series of underground bases were built for them. Some 75, and it was covered in Congress by saying these were special retreats for the president in case of a nuclear war.
What did they want these bases for? Are they tapping our minerals? What are they doing?
They were for combined purposes, basically underground operations involving the aliens. The Greys cannot stand our sunlight, and they cannot live on the surface.
But what do they want with our planet? I mean, why? What's the big attraction?
What they claimed that they wanted, and this again goes back to what they made in the way of their initial statements, is a place where they can live and develop a new genetic body line because they are dying as a race.
Ah.
They claimed they had great advanced technology, which they would share with us. This was the carrot was put in front of the president's face.
New genetic body line. Did they bring genetics here, or did we come upon that? Is this another piece of alien technology?
We have a great deal of genetic knowledge ourselves these days,
all right.
But they also have their own. And the purpose of the underground bases was to do the hybrid experiments and crossbreeding between humans and aliens.
Mm-hmm.
And from some of the horror stories that have come out of these places, the artificial creations of bodies are so bizarre in some cases that they give rise to all of the legends out of the Greek mythologies and then some, that they have actually exist now. Whether or not they've been successful in a new body line is a moot point. All of the evidence seems to indicate they are not. But the work, if you will, goes on. In the meantime, they did give us some technology. This is only, I'm talking only the Greys, there were other groups. And among it was some medical technology involving a special laser scalpel. Apparently the Greys are heavily involved in the cattle manipulations and the cattle mutilations out throughout the West and out throughout the world. And they use the cattle, certain parts of the cattle apparently, for their not only their experiments but part of their feeding process, because they have such an atrophied intestinal tract and digestive tract they cannot eat in a normal manner. They have to absorb their nutrients through the skin. which is a very strange and difficult process.
How do you absorb nutrients through the skin, aside
Well,
from
if you-
osmosis?
if you
But
or
how do you
I-
osmosize?
If you or I, as a human being, go take a bath in a tub of water, water is absorbed through the skin. That's a perfectly normal process. And if you put certain things in that water, whatever's in the water will also be absorbed through the skin to a degree. They do
Blood,
the same thing.
nutrients,
Yes.
minerals?
They do the same thing. They mix vats of blood and sit in them. And there are certain other elements of both animals and humans that are put in these mixes, and that's their nutrition.
That sounds so horrible.
It is. It's the way they apparently live. Now, that's only one group. The others, apparently, other groups are not in the same mode. Either during this time or prior, other groups arrived. Certain of them have been here a long time, such as the Orion Confederation groups. The mainline Orion people are 7 foot tall, typically.
The tall ones,
Very tall, right?
like in Close Encounters? Tall and thin,
Yes, perhaps.
kind of delicate?
The tall, thin, delicate ones are the old grays. There is a series of old grays which run 7 foot high. They're approximately 1,200 years old minimum. And they do not have much to do with the small, short grays, so to speak, 3 foot, 3.5 foot. Those 3.5 footers are considered almost clones, and they're considered a peculiar form of worker, if you will, to the larger grays, because they come in various assorted sizes, if you will. According to the reports I have seen and the information I have read, there's another larger group of grays, about 4.5 foot, possibly up to 5, who have large hooked noses and facial features similar to our own, but they are still basically grays. And there's even a larger group yet.
Sounds like Rumpelstiltskin, but go ahead.
There's even a larger group yet that run 5.5 foot, and apparently are male-female. Now, the smaller grays
Now, just
are
a minute, you're
neutral.
talking about clones, but could these just be, as we would look at them, different races?
Yes, they
Okay.
could well be.
Okay.
The larger ones apparently do mate in the normal manner as we consider
Yes.
mating.
Yes.
The others have lost the capability totally, the small ones. They do not mate. They reproduce by a process of cloning or hybridization and growing in a way which we don't really understand. Some government people may. It's not well defined, and it's not well reported.
It sounds like we're stuck with these people,
Very much so.
this culture, whatever you want to call it, from outer space, because we really don't have the capability of defeating them.
That has been one of the big problems. There have been massive government efforts, all undercover, to produce weapon systems to clear them from the planet. Every attempt to do so has failed, and we have lost certain numbers of military personnel in some of these operations. And they are ingrained in the planet, if you will. Their stories are that, quote, they like it here because this planet is very similar to their old home planet, which suffered some kind of disaster. The Greys are talking about, not some of the others. And they like it here, and they intend to stay. And they've made
And
it quite clear.
there wouldn't be any other races out there from the other planets and galaxies that would come here to our aid. Why should they? Or should they?
That's a very debatable point. Yes, why should they?
This is
If
what
we got
UFO
ourselves-
seminars are made of.
If we got ourselves into this kind of a mess, we have to literally get ourselves out of it. Now, there are other groups, the Orion Confederation. There are subgroups within that confederation. There's another totally independent group, but somehow has formed an alliance with the Orions, is known as the Syrians, Sirius A. Then there is the Leverons, which are part of the Orion Confederation, and they were the ones who supplied the bulk of the technology for the Phoenix Project, the Leverons. The Orions were in the background, and apparently they were hoping to take over the whole project. And the Syrians are also there with a very high order of electronic technology. They supplied some of the equipment also, from what I understand. And you have all kinds of other aliens. You have, of course, the Pleiadians, which have no part in this, and while they had offered several times to help us with our problems, the offers were turned down, and are now in a strange position. We have become, it would appear, allied with some of these alien groups, and therefore it's hands-off. If the human governments form an alliance, a working alliance with the aliens, and accept them, then what happens from this point on is our own problem. If the aliens had come in and invaded and had not been accepted, then Pleiadians or certain other outside groups would have a right to come in and remove them. But since we have agreed to their arrival, we have agreed to give them bases, have agreed to work with them, and have agreed to have an interchange of technology, and have allowed and fostered their staying here, and are working in various processes of cross-breeding, however successful or unsuccessful they may be, then they are part of our planet, part of our environment, and have become, in essence, part of our government. Very secretively, but nevertheless part of our government. Consequently, outside help is almost impossible. The only exception now would be if the Combine went out in space and tried to invade another planetary system somewhere in our galaxy, then there would be reason to take action. But as long as they remain here on Earth and we don't interfere with anybody outside, we are caught up in our own stew, literally.
Our own stew. That's a good way to put it right now, and I hate to think of how those Greys eat. We'll be back in just a moment. Okay, you going to take it over?
Yeah, take it over for another 10. We got it. Linda, continuing now with our guest, Al Bielek. There's a book called The Philadelphia Experiment and Other UFO Conspiracies. I say get this book right now. It's on the newsstand. If you can't get it, give me a call and I can tell you where. Okay, we're continuing now along the lines of extraterrestrial intervention, and you said we have a working liaison with them, our governments and most governments. Then there's been a big hoopla about the one world power of unifying the world against an alien threat, but the alien threat is already here, in other words.
That's the problem.
Okay, so in other words, I also hear that not only in exchange they're giving us information for the stealth technology, also they gave us information for the Excalibur, which I understand is like a sonic device, sonic cannon, and wherefore some of our pilots are now piloting UFO craft up around Nevada.
That's true.
That there's a whole area of
and we've also started manufacturing modified aircraft, which are based on UFO, if you will, designs. One of the interesting exposés of this was somewhat tongue-in-cheek, but nevertheless, you got the message, was last August in, I believe, Aviation Week and Space Technology. They did a series on the new experimental aircraft of our government, Air Force and Navy. The Navy was working with an A-12 aircraft, and that thing is a triangular wedge-shaped aircraft, which is almost a direct duplicate of the Gray's ships, the smaller ones. And they have stated in that article that there have been some very strange tests out in Edwards Air Force Base area of California, where people were awakened at 2 and 3 in the morning with noises and rumblings, which were reminiscent of the old Saturn V tests many decades prior, about 20 years per hour. And these new aircraft make so much noise in certain of the new engine designs that they'd wake up whole communities at 3 o'clock in the morning when they were testing them, always in the middle of the night. Other aircraft have been seen flying, which are moving much faster than our standard aircraft, faster than the SR-71s apparently. And the indications are that we are now beginning to develop technologies of our own based on alien technologies and based on the beginning of understanding of how they work. We have an aircraft called the Aurora, which flies from Edwards, perhaps not only Edwards, from there straight up and goes direct to the moon non-stop, and will carry a payload. It does not have multi-stage boosters.
Boy, that is something hot. Now, again, there's so much information that you have. I want to find out what you know about the wheat field rings, which these round circles are imprinted within grass and cornfields all over the world now, especially in England.
It's been very heavy in England, yes. The nature of that would indicate a type of UFO presence, and I understand that with all of the furor over this in England, BBC set up TV cameras a few months ago to try and photograph on the chance that they might catch one of these in the process of creation. They caught one in the process of creation and apparently caught a UFO-type aircraft or craft with it. They then, that is BBC, then said, well, there was a camera defect and they didn't really get anything and it was never broadcast.
Because the intelligence network said don't show it.
Right, the intelligence network, the secret government does not want the world to know the involvement of UFOs, ETs, and the whole 9 yards here on planet Earth.
Because they want to control, they want to have the ones that have liaison with them and get all the secrets and have the power, in other words.
In essence, yes. There is a basis for this consideration because many years ago, if you remember in 1953, when there was a huge overflying of UFO-type craft over the White House in Washington, D.C., for 2 days and 2 nights on radar.
That was 52, wasn't it?
52 or 53, perhaps it was 52. As a result of that, the Brookings Institute was given a commission to study the nature of the problem and make recommendations, namely, what happens if an alien technology comes in on an older technology, a newer one, which is far superior. One could draw, and they did use as an analogy, what happens if, let's say, Western man descends into Africa, in dark Africa, in some of these villages where, or down in Borneo, where these people had no technology, had never heard of some of the modern developments, and suddenly we show up with aircraft and helicopters and all this sort of thing. What happens to them? The Brookings Institute said flat out that it's either one of two consequences of that sort of an encounter. Number one, the lesser technology or society is absorbed in the greater society and technology, or the lesser one just ceases to exist, it disintegrates. So based on those reports of the Brookings Institute, our government took the stand, and most major governments took the stand, that we could not afford to let the public know fully, at least at that time, the nature of this invasion, if you will, and that we were being invaded by a group of much higher technology than we had, because it would upset the world order, the economy, our industrial base and our establishment, much less the political, but the entire military complex, the manufacturing complex. All of our ideas would go down the tubes. And
along with religion, too.
Along with religion in many cases. It would all go down the tubes, and they felt they couldn't allow this. We'd have to do it on a gradual, piecemeal basis. Today, if you look at your TV, and I'm sure you'll find this abroad, but here you have programs like Alien Nation, War of the Worlds, and a lot of other TV programs, all dealing with aliens. Star Trek, many dealing with aliens.
But isn't it true that some of the technology now employed in Star Trek is actually happening? We indicate, I think it was Duncan that indicated to us that he was sitting in a chair in Montauk and projected into North Vietnam, and that then he was revealing some information to the North Vietnamese, whatever they were, and then after that he was put in a sweat box, 3 by 3 by 5, and after this information he gave them, he was projected back to Montauk into this particular chair. Is any truth to that?
I don't know whether it involved a chair or not, but
or a certain unit.
It was true that he was involved in certain of the operations in Vietnam.
So they do have a teleportation device?
Yes, he was either dropped in by aircraft or was teleported there, and the whole purpose was to give military disinformation to the North Vietnamese. He was allowed to be tortured. He allowed it, and it was arranged, and after a certain point you're supposed to break, so he would do the number of breaking and then give them the information which they would assume was correct and was totally false, or doctored information. And then he was returned back to the Montauk project. Yes, that is very possible, and I understand that did happen.
Let me ask you, Al, have you yourself ever witnessed or been in contact with or had an association with any extraterrestrials as we know them today?
Yes, and as part of the Montauk project. See, what I didn't mention earlier, I didn't get into it, was that in 1947 I was removed from the Navy and was given the full 9 yards of brainwashing, given a, shall we say, an age regression treatment, which the government has techniques now for physical age regression. Only they did mine on the deluxe version. They ran me back to the age of 1. Now, how large is a person at the age of 1? Probably big, a baby. Put me in another family called the Bielek family, because my original name was Edward Cameron. Totally wiped of all memories, so I grew up again all over. Now, some years later, I became an engineer. Went through the Navy again, too, for that matter. Became an electronic engineer, and I was picked up by the Phoenix Project, among other things. Now, that was secret. It was not part of my memory patterns at that time, and this memory of working in that project, with very distinct memories of what parts I took part in, only recovered as starting in 1986. The project crashed in 83. It's rather fast, but there are reasons why. But as part of that project is Al Bielek. I had memories of various things I worked with. There were aliens in the underground. I remember very clearly the strange look of the Leverons, or a lot of them. They were the technicians, so to speak.
What do they look like? Do they look anything like ourselves?
Essentially, they looked nearly human. They had 6-foot bodies. They had normal appendages, feet, arms, legs, faces, but their heads were a different shape. The skin was greenish.
Let me ask you this. Right now we're broadcasting to you from New York City on Park Avenue. And we could go out and walk the streets of New York City at this present moment. Would we encounter or see anybody who resembles this? But New York, there's a conglomeration of everything.
There is a conglomerate of everything here, and I'm sure you would find aliens on the streets. The problem is they walk the streets. They're quite well disguised. And you can do this rather readily. Put on a normal set of clothes. Since they have the normal physical appearance in terms of shape, but not physical skin appearance, or the facial appearance is different. Put on a set of clothes, a hat, and a set of dark glasses, and walk on the streets of New York on a not too bright day. They would not be picked out. They would not be recognized.
Do they speak like us? Or?
Yes, they can. They can speak perfectly normal English.
In any language, I imagine.
Probably. I only heard them in English.
But what's the outcome of all this? What can we expect from this? What is your far-flung speculation of how this is going to be solved? If it's not going to be solved, is it going to be escalated? And if it's going to be escalated, for what purpose?
At the present time, it would appear that it's going to be escalated. The end purpose is takeover of this planet by the Orion complex, as I understand it. The purpose of that takeover is that they want this planet for its technological base, manufacturing capabilities, and of course a certain number of humans to run all that technology. We are at the point technologically where we can build very advanced hardware based on alien designs as long as we're told what to build and shown how to build it.
Now, what about all the other people upon the planet now? Are we expendable?
In their view, yes.
We
are expendable for the reason that the planet is already overpopulated, and they realize this as well as our own human interests. And they will probably do at some point a mass extermination in some form or other of those they don't want.
Have they been back of anything like the AIDS project or something like that? Where
I doubt that the aliens were in back of that. Some people think they were.
Yeah.
But there's a very great deal of evidence to show that this was terrestrially designed, manufactured, and the thought for it came from normal human sources.
We better watch out, because I feel that our Declaration of Independence is going to be shot at any day.
It could be.
Yeah.
This is one of the problems. If we get to a full one-world government as envisioned by those who would like it now, that is within, let's say, the next year or two, it would be a very despotic, very suppressive government.
Now, if you had a position, a platform, speaking to all those in the audience right now, is there something in your own estimation, something in your mind that you would tell them that they can do to protect themselves from all of this?
Very hard. It would require certain types of small portable electronic hardware. This is in the process of being developed by a private group. It would also require a greater metaphysical knowledge, because I say this out of my own experience, that if you develop sufficient mental and psychic awareness and recognize the pitfalls and the traps of how one can be brainwashed and seduced either by hypnosis or by electronics, eventually you can find your own means to counter this.
In other words, if you raise consciousness high enough, you'll be given the ability.
You're essentially immune, but it's very few who can do this to date.
Al, you've been a wealth of information, and we have to have you back again. Please come back again when you're in town.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. And Linda will be right back. My mind is boggled. I can't say anymore.
Not mine. I'm dyeing my skin green. Then I'm going to blend right in when they take over.
But what he said, the metaphysical...
I'm already getting ready.
I see that. Yeah. But sometimes you look like that when you use that soap in the morning. Okay. Or that green mud pack. I'm going to be pretty.
Laszlo, yes.
Anyway, when you mentioned the fact of metaphysical techniques and employing the spiritual self, that's probably one of the greatest protections.
Yes, it is. Because when you employ any intuitive or psychic talents, what happens is that you turn off the mind, which is a logical and important process. But the mind does restrict one from being able to go beyond what they see, beyond what they actually hear, and it would link into an abstract impression of what might really be going on very quickly, very swiftly. But it works.
Wouldn't it be funny if all the Macumba, the black magic groups, the Santeria, and all the others from around the world, all these groups that really project, they could start projecting to the Orions. They could do their voodoo and woogie stuff.
Throw them in a cauldron, couldn't they?